Yeah, if anybody was paying attention to the news recently, um, you got a chance to see that President Biden made his first sub-Saharan Africa trip in the last month of his presidency. He recently arrived to the country of, checks notes, Angola, of all places, on the 3rd of December. And then we were able to then ask ourselves now, why is that? Now, if you ask yourself, why did he end up going to Angola, of all places, you have to look at a little bit of a zoomed out picture here, as Toad just expertly described, between a very complicated conflict between massive numbers of insurgent groups with very conflicting interests and different needs, and some are allies and some are not, and some were allies but maybe not now, and these how those transitions happen. What Angola represents ultimately is the future battleground of economics, the current battleground of economic statecraft, and the future battleground of a soft war of what I would call resource rich periphery states. Ultimately, everybody talks about the South Pacific between the United States and China, but there's really actually a deeper understanding going on between the extraction zones or the resource rich zones that are going on in periphery states like Peru, Guyana, and in this particular case, Angola. So, why did President Biden go to Angola in the 3rd of December, his only sub Saharan visit ever in Africa, and ultimately make the claim at that point we're going to increase our investment into the country? You have to zoom out just a little bit further. As we all know about the Belt and Road Initiative, we've all heard about essentially the debtors' prisons that China ultimately puts in countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Zambia and Zimbabwe and other countries with which they provide essentially a debtors' prison investment towards. Angola was actually the OG, the original gangster, of the first one where this took place. In 2002, Angola ended their civil war finally, and they were in desperate need of actual resource investment into their country. And along came China at the time. China instilled at that point the first country ultimately with which they provided that oil resource backed loans, or otherwise known as oil for food, or in this particular case, oil for infrastructure backing from the Chinese. In order to be able to produce and get more energy out of oil rich Angola, the Chinese were paying for the actual oil extraction equipment and the infrastructure to be able to extract that resource, that energy out of the country. In exchange, China was able to build for them hydroelectric dams, roads, anything of that nature over the last several decades. Ultimately, though, the balance of the trade relationship got a little out of whack, and that's a little bit interesting for China. Ultimately, China were used to them being a primary exporter to the rest of the world. However, in Angola, what's interesting is they were a 6-to-1 offset importer compared to their export needs. That means that Angola was actually giving a ton to China. Ultimately, 72% of all of their oil from Angola went to the Chinese. The rest of it either stayed internal to their country, and ultimately, China was their only oil export partner. This eclipsed to a high watermark, and you can learn a lot about this in Toad's Substack, but the high watermark of roughly 8 to 10% of all Chinese oil actually came from Angola in certain periods of the 2010 timeframe. It was actually their second largest importer of oil, next to Saudi Arabia, from a foreign nation coming into China at the time. So that large export imbalance, that 6-to-1 ratio, the 72% going to China at the time, this led to, I would say, an outsized number of influence of the Angolese and the Chinese together. So naturally, you can see the U.S. would have interest there to want to apply influence for a country that's on the Atlantic coast in sub-Saharan Africa that we could apply influence towards, noting that China doesn't necessarily have the best reach in the world. It also has other interests for us, the access to landlocked DRC. Angola shares a border with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or otherwise known as the DRC. DRC is important to the whole entire world because it has a number of resources, in particular the two C's, copper and cobalt, and the three T's, tin, tantalum, and tungsten. It's tough getting stuff out of DRC. It often takes upwards of 35 to 40 days to get anything out of that landlocked country and get that into either the Atlantic or to the Indian Ocean side of the continent. Ultimately, what this led to was in the past several years, the United States and predominantly the West investing in multiple billions of dollars into Angola under green energy deals to be able to build rail lines into the DRC. Ultimately, these green energy deals were designed to be able to build improved infrastructure to be able to take out DRC minerals faster. And that was going to be known as extorting minerals out of exporting minerals out of the Lobito corridor. In 2023, Angola and China and their relationship starts to deteriorate a little bit because Angola leaves OPEC, wants to produce more oil. The numbers are starting to dwindle. China realizes, oh crap, we're a little bit too dependent on Angola. We need to diversify. Angola drops from number 2 to number 8 on the oil export list to China. And ultimately, the result of that is the United States sees an opportunity at that point to be able to instill our influences into Angola to decrease Chinese influence while at the same time extracting minerals out of DRC. And that's where you end up getting the infrastructure projects from companies like Ivanhoe, which is a copper mining company that works out of DRC and most of Angola, which ends up building rail infrastructure. And of note, the most important part of this, which is a little known mining newsletter that came out back in August of 2024, stated that they were able to do a land speed record of a 6-day extraction of copper cathodes out of DRC to the port. Now, that sounds like very nerdy crap talk that nobody really cares about, except for the fact when you compare the fact that 6 days to get copper cathodes out of DRC, the Chinese takes them 35 to 40 days to get it out to the Indian Ocean side. And that 5 times faster mark is going to equal a lot of dollars in the future. So, Angola is a periphery state with which there's economic statecraft and economic warfare, you can make the argument that's going on. So President Biden's visit, though nice, though very pleasant, often has deeper undertones to the broader geopolitical picture. And hopefully, and what we could also plan on seeing as Intel members is projecting what that looks like for the future. And the best person for that has been a lot of the writings from Toad Substack, looking into the inspection of Angola, of Peru, of Guyana, of Central America, a lot of Western Hemisphere investments. But there will be a future to where a conflict looks a lot like insurgent operations taking place in Syria, mixed with a lot of resource extraction operations taking place in periphery states. It's not all the South China Sea.